Okay, so over the course of the next few videos, including this one, we're going to talk about the ways in which reasoning goes wrong. These are known as informal fallacies. They are specifically errors in reasoning that do not have anything to do with the structure of the argument, but instead have to do with poor assumptions, emotional appeals, diversionary tactics, and the like. So, what we'll do is we'll first cover personal attacks and emotional appeals. Then we'll cover fallacies of weak induction in a second video. And then the third video will cover fallacies of unwarranted assumption or diversion. In each one of these videos, we will focus on recognizing fallacies in ordinary language. In other words, our focus is going to be not on memorizing this or that fallacy name, but on being able to analyze a piece of reasoning in such a way that you can identify what the error is, so what's the mechanical issue, as well as explanation of why we should avoid reasoning in that way. So, first off, we have to understand that a fallacy is an error in, a fallacious argument, rather, is an error in reasoning. And there are two ways in which there can be logical fallacies. One is a formal fallacy, and we saw that there are quite a few instances of formal errors in reasoning when we were studying the distinction between a valid and an invalid argument. So here's an example of a formally valid piece of reasoning, and then here's an example of an a formally invalid piece of reasoning. So a valid piece of reasoning can look like this: A or B, not A, therefore B. And a formally invalid piece of reasoning example looks very similar to the formally valid piece of reasoning, but it's structurally flawed. A or B, A, so not B. And again, here's another example of a valid piece of reasoning: if A, then B, A, therefore B. And a formally invalid piece of reasoning: if A, then B, B, therefore A. Now, when we're dealing with informal errors of reasoning, we're not talking about an error that's created by the structure of the argument, but instead it's typically, but not always the case, that the reasoning is flawed because the arguer preys on our emotions, a psychological state, diverts our attention, misrepresents another's reasoning, and so forth. So there's there's sort of no architectural problem with the reasoning. It's the content that's flawed. Specifically, the content's relation, the content's premise to conclusion relation, for the reasons I mentioned just a moment ago. Nevertheless, these are psychologically or emotionally compelling pieces of reasoning, and that's why we tend to fall prey to them. So let's just remind ourselves of a few ways in which we can talk about what would be good reason for a claim and what we would consider to be evidence for a claim. In law, there are rules of evidence. We can talk about circumstantial evidence, physical evidence, a preponderance or an abundance of evidence. We can talk about reasonable doubt as the standard whereby we conclude that, let's say in a criminal case, someone is guilty or not. In science, we have empirical standards that are interpreted. Empirical evidence that's interpreted with scientific standards, which involve scientific methodology. And then we oftentimes think about evidence in terms of our own experience, testimony, analogical reasoning, statistical reasoning. But it still is the case, as we will see, that in any environment, reasoning can go horribly wrong. So let's take an example of a fairly common way of reasoning and talk about it in terms of what seems to be working well and where we might critique it. If each of us ought to be free to assume risks that we think are worth taking, shouldn't athletes have the same freedom as anyone else to take performance-enhancing drugs? In particular, if athletes prefer the gains in performance allegedly provided by the use of steroids, along with the increased risk of harm to the alternative of less risk and worse performance, what gives anyone the right to interfere with their choice? After all, if we should not forbid smokers from risking their health by smoking, why should we prohibit track stars or weightlifters from taking risks with their health in pursuit of their goals? So notice that the context of the argument is the risk to our health of performance-enhancing drugs and whether or not each of us should be allowed to take that risk. And the arguer makes a comparison to smoking. So one of the ways in which you can analyze this argument is in terms of whether or not the analogy to smoking is a good one. Are there enough positive comparisons between the discussion of the health risks of smoking and us not being forbidden to smoke, in principle anyway? We might not be allowed to smoke at certain areas, but if we want to smoke cigarettes, we may. Nobody comes into our house and tells us to stop doing it. Are there enough positive comparisons there with steroid use? So the way that we talk about arguments, as we've seen when we were discussing strong and weak inductive arguments, is to see, in this case, how strong are and relevant are the comparisons between smoking and steroid use. Here's another example from inductive reasoning. 93% of studies on student testing, including the use of large-scale and high-stakes standardized tests, found a, quote, positive effect on student achievement, according to a peer-reviewed 100-year analysis of testing research completed in 2011 by testing scholar Richard P. Phelps. Therefore, standardized testing improves education in the U.S. Here again, we have a piece of experiential reasoning. We have an argument based on a statistic about student testing. And what you want to do when you're evaluating this argument, among the things you want to do, is to see if there is a strong enough correlation between what the studies found about student testing and the conclusion about standardized testing generally improving education in the U.S. You can ask questions about the statistics. What's the standard deviation, for example? Is it the case that the studies were done in such a way as to comport with standards on doing, let's say, surveys and so forth? So what we want to do is distinguish, when we're evaluating an argument, how well the evidence does or does not support the conclusion. What an argument should do is withstand scrutiny. So I mentioned just a moment ago with the analogical and statistical reasoning examples that you need to be able to analyze the argument and sort of push that argument and see if it withstands some critique. In addition, a strong argument should provide intellectually compelling evidence. And I really want to emphasize this idea of the intellectual force of the argument, because, as we will see, so many ways in which reasoning goes bad depends on appealing to our emotional states, our psychological states, as opposed to evidence upon which we can all agree and then see where it leads us. So a strong argument isn't going to prey upon our emotions. In addition, a strong argument does not win, if you will, by making a competing argument look bad. I mentioned to you that there's really no official classification. It is the case that Mia, might find that that all fallacies, in a sense, fail to have a premise conclusion support such that they're all fallacies of relevance. Or I might say, oh no, I'm going to classify fallacies according to those that prey on a certain emotion. But so it really doesn't matter how you classify. What does matter is that when you do classify a number of fallacies, or when you group fallacies under a certain heading, what you're doing is you're helping yourself organize your thinking about fallacies. So let's move on. First, I want to mention that we're so lucky to have a lot of resources at our disposal. It's not a bad idea to look around at some of the good ones. It's after a while you sort of develop an eye for what works and what doesn't in terms of accuracy and so forth when it comes to videos where the video maker is telling you that thus and such is an example of this, that, or the other fallacy, and you think, no, I don't think that person's right. The more you study fallacies, the easier it gets to see what the main problem is in a given piece of reasoning. I do think that the website that you see, the link to which you see at the bottom of this slide, is a really nice introduction to fallacies. So you might want to check that out at some point. Each of these fallacies involves using emotion rather than reason. So with personal attacks, including poisoning the well in Tu Quoque, the idea is to effectively diminish a person, make people feel negative emotions about the person so that the person's position or argument can be eliminated. And then in the latter three cases, appeal to the people, appeal to pity, and appeal to force, we have an appeal made to the hearer or the reader of the argument so that that person feels a certain way about the issue at hand. So in the case of the personal attacks, someone is trying to make us feel negatively towards someone, and in the latter type of fallacy, we're supposed to be feeling something about the position that is advanced. There is a little bit of an overlap with respect to appeal to pity and the personal attacks, but insofar as appeal to pity doesn't involve a personal attack, but we're supposed to feel sorry for the person in question, there is a person-directed appeal. So let's get started. For each fallacy name, I have an introductory slide with 3 bullet points. A definition of the fallacy, the sort of mechanics of the fallacy, and then an explanation or an attempted explanation as to why the reasoning fails. I strongly encourage you to use this format when you analyze and evaluate a piece of reasoning that you're pretty sure is fallacious. First, what you want to do is determine what's going wrong here. So when you make an appeal to emotion, you argue in such a way that prompts someone to feel something and then form a belief based on the feeling rather than the evidence. And the mechanical problem with this reasoning is that emotions just are. They don't have truth values. So a sentence about an emotion has a truth value. I feel sad. That's either true or false. But my feeling isn't evidence that such and such a conclusion is correct. So let's take a look at some ways in which people argue by way of an appeal to emotion. Arguably, the most popular is the ad hominem, that is the personal attack. An ad hominem is a personal attack when, rather than addressing a position that someone has put forward, or rather than addressing an argument that someone has put forward, instead you attack the person, not their argument. So the ad hominem occurs in the context of argument making. It's not just an arbitrary out of nowhere attack against the person, right? So, if out of nowhere I walk up to somebody and I say, "You're stupid," or "You're dumb," or "You have the wrong political beliefs, I don't like you," those two being conflated, by the way, you're not actually engaged in the fallacy known as ad hominem. Instead, again, person A advances an argument or advances a position, and then person B ignores the argument, ignores the position, and instead attacks the person. So let's say not liking a person doesn't make that person's argument or that person's position bad or wrong. So what someone claims and their argument in support of what they claim is entirely distinct from whether or not we like them or think they'll gain in some way if the argument succeeds. Let's take a look at how this works. So here are some versions. X is a bad argument because Y, who advanced it, doesn't know what he or she is talking about. X is a bad argument because Y, who advanced it, is a jerk, ugly, mean, etc. X is a bad argument because the person advancing it is only doing so because of their affiliation with a group that supports X, or X has a vested interest in seeing the claim succeed. And X is a bad argument because Y, who advanced it, didn't follow his or her own advice.
Amen. Okay. We have a problem in this country. It's called Muslims. We know our current president is one.
Right.
You know he's not even an American.
We need this
Birth
question. This is
certificates,
the
man.
first question.
But anyway, we have training camps growing where they want to kill us. Mm-hmm. That's my question. When can we get rid of
We're going to be looking at a lot of...
Okay, so what you heard in the video obviously wasn't an explicitly formulated argument, and I think that there's more going on than what I have as an attempt at formulating the argument, but I think it's something anyway like this. Muslims are not real Americans. They are terrorists training to kill Americans. Our president, being a Muslim himself, won't stop the terrorists. Therefore, when we get rid of the current president, the new president should get rid of Muslims. It's hard to analyze the argument in a charitable way, largely because there are statements that the man makes that are just simply false. But part of what he wants to do is to say that we can't trust the position that a Muslim would take. We can't trust our president. He's Muslim, right? Where apparently being Muslim is a bad thing. And so what he's doing is he's basically saying, look, don't listen to the president and don't listen to Muslims. They're dangerous. And so we need to get rid of them. And then any president who comes on the scene should be committed to doing that. There's other stuff going on, but I think this is a fairly common example of the way in which an ad hominem is explicitly stated. I mean, he's making overt personal attacks, but there's an implicit attack against a position or against a group of people just because of their religious affiliation. Here's another example from the book or the film, I, Robot. One of the characters is having a conversation with a robot, and Sonny, the robot, is taking umbrage to what Spooner says. Spooner says, robots don't feel fear, they don't feel anything, they don't eat, they don't sleep. Sonny says, I do. I've even had dreams. And Spooner says, human beings have dreams. Even dogs have dreams, but not you. You're just a machine, an imitation of life. Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece? And Sonny responds, can you? Now, there's more than one thing going on here, but as far as the ad hominem goes, basically, in the context of a conversation that Spooner and Sonny are having, what Spooner is saying is effectively, we don't need to listen to you, or I don't need to listen to you, Sonny, because you're just a robot. You're in a sense, you're not human. You're not worth listening to. And then there are some great cartoons. Or not cartoons, but photos that people make cartoons out of effectively by way of the little text bubbles. And here we have one goose saying, we share many genetic characteristics with ducks because we have evolved from a common ancestor. And the other goose says, you're closed-minded and stupid and you eat corn. You don't know anything. So rather than addressing the claim that the first goose makes and saying, I disagree and here's why, the claim that the first goose makes is being completely disregarded and on the basis of apparently that goose being closed-minded and stupid and eating corn. And then another one with what look to be a couple of sparrows. One makes the claim, the moral claim, I believe that human cloning is wrong, rather than addressing that. This is one of those versions of an ad hominem where what you say is being thrown out because of some characteristic, in this case apparently being an idiot. So the second sparrow says, of course you'd say that, you're an idiot. So the content is just entirely disregarded. And then to be politically fair to both sides, here's another version of ad hominem, this time committed by President Obama, or actually this was candidate Obama back in 2008.
This is in the best interest of the United States.
Sarah Palin, taking aim at your decision to restrict use of nuclear weapons, your pledge not to strike nations, non-nuclear nations, who abide by the non-proliferation treaty. Here's what she said. She said, it's unbelievable. No other administration would do it. And then she likened it to kids on a playground. She said, you're like a kid who says, punch me in the face, and I'm not going to retaliate.
Yeah.
Your response?
I really have no response to that. The last I checked, Sarah Palin's not much of an expert on nuclear issues.
So as a political strategy, it makes sense. You paint your opponent as someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, and that undermines their credibility. And it may very well be the case that Sarah Palin was not the best candidate, was not the most adept at matters of policy and governing and so forth. And that's the biggest difficulty that we have, I think, with the ad hominem is it's at times really tempting. Someone may say something that's just outrageously wrong, and instead of just saying, well, you're mistaken that, or you've said something that's not correct, instead we go to the attack, which is, you don't know what you're talking about. And I get that. I understand it. I think we've all been guilty of it. But rather than saying you're not an expert, what you need to do is say, okay, well, what you're claiming is not the case, and lay out, what the facts actually are. So we want to avoid the ad hominem. There are all kinds of ways in which, I should rephrase that. There are all sorts of ways in which there's a real fine line between dismissing somebody, dismissing what somebody says on the basis of their lack of expertise, and wanting to accept a claim as true based on somebody's expertise. And what I mean by that is this. I mean, if you go to your doctor's office and your doctor says, oh, it looks like I've done your blood work and it looks like you've got, I don't know, a bacterial infection, here's some antibiotics. Or, I've looked, your symptoms are very common of this winter's, flu, here's some medication. You're probably not going to ask the doctor to prove it. You accept the doctor as an authority, and you accept that the conclusion the doctor has come to about your condition is correct, and you accept that the conclusion that you should take the antibiotics. Having said that, however, it's also the case that if you're dealing with something rather serious, your doctor might say, look, it's important for you to get a second opinion, or you say, I should get a second opinion. And that's a way of showing that you're not simply relying on that person's expertise. So so going back then to this problem of ad hominem, you have, for example, the uproar in some circles over Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change. And a lot of people were criticizing the Pope, saying that he should stick with religious matters, not with scientific issues, because that should be left to the scientists. But the reality is that if the Pope wants to make an argument about climate change, then we should deal with whether or not that argument's any good, not that he does or doesn't have the expertise to mount it. Some people fell prey, I think, to this ad hominem, because they said, well, wait a minute, he's got a master's, I think, in chemistry, so he's qualified to speak on this. But even if we're thinking about his qualifications, he was speaking in the context of his qualification as a religious moral leader, and mounted a moral argument. He accepted as fact climate change. So when somebody like this person, Steve Malloy, sort of badmouths the Pope and basically associates him with communism, and then basically dismisses him on that basis, a sort of guilt by association, you've got a version of an ad hominem. In addition, to say that he shouldn't be listened to, the Pope shouldn't be listened to because he's not a scientist, is a flat-out ad hominem. And then we have an example that I think is fantastic. I think it's a complicated fallacy that's being committed by the woman who's second from the right, not the woman in the pink coat, but the woman next to her. You'll see this slide again, you'll see this video again in a little bit, but take a listen and then we'll talk about this.
Expressed concern before about this meeting, and times are tough right now, and we've cut teachers' positions, and we're rationing paper, and this is a trip to the beach. So if there's any way that you could take care of business, either video conferencing or pay for the trip out of your own pocket. And while this is going on, we also got a brochure for a nice trip to Boston. And, times are tough right now. I think we need to watch where we're spending our money.
Thank you, Ms. Murphy. Ms. Watson.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Ms. Murphy, that times are tough, because as I see in the October 19, 2011 memo from Dr. Fulmer, he says, combining all the costs referenced below, the lawsuit by Ms. Kim Murphy has cost the school district in excess of $1.9 million. I'm trying to weigh $1.9 million to a school board conference where we learn how to be better school board members to help our district. Which do we get better return for?
So here, like I said, we've got a couple things going on, but the focus right now is the ad hominem. So there was a claim made that the board conference at Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, would spend, or sorry, the board would be spending a lot of money, the school board would be spending a lot of money going to a conference at Hilton Head, South Carolina, which is a really kind of swanky resort area. And given the budget crisis, the money would be better spent elsewhere. And rather than responding to that, the second person, the one who is next to the woman in pink, basically said, well, why should we listen to you? You're making the school board spend $1.9 million on some lawsuit. So rather than address the issue that was raised, which is whether or not money should be spent going to a conference on Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, she said, well, we shouldn't listen to you because you're spending a lot of money. So it's a really nice ad hominem example. Remember I mentioned a moment ago that one of the ad hominems against Pope Francis's encyclical was that since Pope Francis wasn't or isn't a scientist, that he should leave the issue of science or of climate change alone. So in a radio interview, Rick Santorum says, the church has gotten it wrong a few times on science. We probably are better off leaving science to the scientists and focusing on what we're really good at, which is theology and morality. When we get involved with controversial and scientific theories, I think the church is not as forceful and not as credible. I've said this to the Catholic bishops many times when they get involved in agricultural policy or things like that are really outside the scope of what the church's main message is. We're better off sticking to the things that are really the core teachings of the church as opposed to getting involved in every other kind of issue that happens to be popular at the time. So the problem is, if it's the case that the church needs to speak only on issues of theology and morality, there's an assumption there, of course, that anybody who, let's say, wouldn't be a church specialist would not be able to speak on issues of theology and morality, right? Doesn't it go both ways? If it's the case that the Pope shouldn't speak on climate change, maybe it should be the case that people who aren't members of or specialists within the Catholic Church don't get to speak on moral or theological issues. So again, the issue is whether or not the argument that the Pope mounted is any good, not his specific credentials. Okay, the next fallacy we're going to look at is mass appeal or appeal to the people. And here, the main issue is that the arguer says, thus and such is true because everybody believes it or everyone feels it. Right, so the truth is said effectively to be dependent on what people believe. But believing a claim simply because everybody else does or because you wish to be accepted is not the same as the claim having been demonstrated. Mass appeal occurs in advertising and politics, maybe to a lesser degree in our own, in our daily lives, but it really is an incredibly effective, albeit poor, mode of reasoning. So here's an example of two famous people in an ad, and the implication is that these people are famous, they're in love, she's wearing a big diamond ring, they're beautiful, and they're wearing fabulous clothes, and somehow you can be like this too. Everybody can get what they want if they just get on the wagon with Balmain.
Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on a boat with the man your man could smell like. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again. The tickets are now diamonds. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a horse.
A couple things are going on, but for the purpose of our fallacy, we get the following. If you want your man to be fabulous and gorgeous, you will have him wear Old Spice. The commercial is an appeal to everyone to be able to be like this guy, and whoever this guy's significant other is, by wearing Old Spice.
Everyone's doing it. Guys are doing it with girls, and girls are doing it with other girls. Some go online and do it with complete strangers. Some people like to do it hard. Some people like to be all chatty-catty with people. I've heard there's over 20 million people doing it now, so it's safe to say that everyone is doing it.
All right, so there's a little misdirection here, where you're thinking that this guy is going in one direction and then he goes in another. But I'd like to use this commercial as another example of appeal to the masses. Everybody's playing Call of Duty, therefore you should do it too. Then here are a few examples that again reinforce the problem with mass appeal. 70% of Americans think marriage equality is immoral, therefore you should not support same-sex marriage. An overwhelming majority of Americans, 92%, believe in God and an afterlife, therefore you should stop being an atheist. And most people are coming around to the idea that medical and recreational marijuana use is acceptable, therefore you should endorse the legalization of marijuana. Again, just because a lot of people think something is the case or is a good idea doesn't mean that they're right. And so it doesn't mean that you should follow in their footsteps. There should be independent evidence for a belief, not just what a bunch of other people happen to think is the case. We also have another emotional appeal. This one is the appeal to pity. A conclusion in this case is supported by evoking pity. So you are asked to draw a conclusion based on your feeling sorry for somebody, as opposed to because they've offered you a what I'll call a legitimate reason. So feeling sorry for someone doesn't make what that person claims is true. You know, suppose that somebody has admitted to a vicious murder and then tries to argue that they shouldn't be put in jail for the murder because it will make their mother really upset, and they don't want to make their mother really upset, and their mother is a very sensitive person and will cry all the time and will be devastated. I mean, obviously, whether or not the murderer's mother would be upset is not a legitimate reason to keep that murderer out of jail. So we get an example like this. I have to graduate on time. My future, my whole life depends on me getting to finish college. My family would be devastated. I would be devastated if I didn't get to finish college. How could you fail me like this? You have to change my grade, please. Now, imagine if this person is pre-med and has just managed to fail their capstone project, which sort of is the ultimate, accumulation of all the work that they did. It's probably not the best idea to send them on to med school if they can't even get the basics and more high-level stuff of biology right. So you have to think about, why it would be a good idea, just because you feel sorry for this person, to let them complete the degree. And here is a cartoon where a kid wants to play and appeals to his dad's sense of pity and love in order to get what he wants. Moving on, we have appeal to force or fear. This is a really common fallacy where, rather than giving good reasons to believe a claim is true, a threat some sort is made. So, I mean, think about it this way. If you're standing at the ATM and you're getting cash out and somebody comes up to you with a gun and says, give me your money, that's a threat, right? The gun is a threat, and you'll give your money. But what if you are standing at the ATM again and the same person comes up with no gun and just says, give me your money? You probably won't. So I'm not suggesting that you do or you don't give up your money if you have a gun pointed at you. What I'm saying is that the threat is what makes you move, not that there's some legitimate reason that the person has for wanting you to give them your money. So the problem, of course, is that the person who's threatening is basically using the power of that threat to win an argument rather than providing good evidence. So let's take a look at some examples. Here is a one that many parents may have tried with their children. And in fact, the story, The Little Boy Who Cried Wolf, is some sort of arguably an appeal to force or fear. But suppose a child has been caught in a lie and the parent says, do you know what happens to little girls and boys who lie? Child says no. Parent says, well, remember when we read The Little Boy Who Cried Wolf? Child says, yes, it was really scary. The parent says, yes, it was. Why? Child says, because the boy lied a bunch of times, and so in the end no one believed him, and then when the wolf came for real, no one came to save him. And the parent says, exactly. Do you want to end up like that little boy? Where the lesson is supposed to be, don't lie if you don't want to end up like the little boy. Of course, one thing you might ask is whether a small child can really grasp non-emotional evidence, but that's a question for another time. And here again, a parent is using force or fear to get his child to do something. Maybe I have issues using parent examples. In any case, the parent says to the child, just remember, son, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, unless you want to lose daddy's love. All right, so we've gone through a number of fallacies in what is a fairly considerably long list of fallacies. I mention this point again because I want you to remember that what is most important about our work here is not simply memorizing fallacy names, but being able to analyze reasoning so that you can expose the errors and explain why we should avoid them. So we will move on now to our second of 3 videos in which we will discuss fallacies of weak induction.